Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Where I turn your attention next to the curious case of Ben Bradley, a mere 28 years of age. So flying in the face of arguments that the Conservative Party is grey and dusty from top to bottom. He's just been made Vice Chairman for Youth, and he's waded into a bit of bother. Now, given that we keep patting ourselves on the back on this programme for trying to avoid lazy pantomime politics. So this fella's a Tory, therefore I think he's great. Or this fella's a Tory, therefore I think he's a scumbag. Which does, I think, pretty much typify an awful lot of political debate up and down the land at the moment. I paused on this one, and I had a few thoughts. The first was the relevance of your past comments to your suitability for a current job depends at least in part upon the concept of representation. So while the alleged journalist Toby Young came under a lot of fire for his sort of misogynistic and profoundly sexist tweets, that for me didn't necessarily impact upon his ability to represent women, whatever the size or relative merits of their breasts. It didn't impact upon his ability to represent women in the context of his job advising the government on universities. What I felt broke that deal, with the comments oddly ignored by a lot of the right-wing journalists screaming foul, were his comments about children with special educational needs and wheelchair users in schools. I think that's why Conservatives like Robert Harfon and Sarah Wollaston and Heidi Allen all lined up to call for his departure, but of course by the time it's been written up in the Sun or the Mail or the Spectator, it's just a bunch of lefty do-gooders. Completely ignore the fact that the only MPs I can name who went on the record for this were all Conservatives. Because I don't know that you could have confidently said to a wheelchair user, this guy has your interests at heart. Yeah? Then you move on to the Labour MP, Jared O'Mara, who we discussed earlier in the week because the Yorkshire Post had done a remarkable expose of his apparent inaction. He was absent from Parliament on medical grounds, but had pledged at the time to continue working in his constituency office, so he wasn't going to go down to Westminster, but he would be able to do what good constituency MPs do, look after the interests and the problems of constituents. The Yorkshire Post revealed he hadn't even been doing that either. A worker at his constituency office was unable to describe a single instance of him doing anything constructive or substantive. And the day after that, or 2 days after that article appeared, the day after we spoke to the bloke that wrote it, Jared O'Mara, the Labour MP elected in Nick Clegg's old constituency, announced that he was returning to work in both Westminster and his Sheffield constituency office. But the reason why the Labour Party suspended him was because he employed on historical social media posts language that was rightly described as homophobic and sexist. Here's the problem. If I said something homophobic now, let me tell you how it would break down. If you didn't like me, because everyone who's listened to this programme for a few years would know that I couldn't be less homophobic. It is a source of never-ending bafflement to me that other people can give a fig about what goes on in somebody else's undercrackers. It really is. I fancy women. I have had periods in my life where I wished I could fancy men because I was going through something of a fallow period in my late teens, but I couldn't. Never. It's never going to happen, ever. And that's it. It's the end of the conversation for me. Oh, look, here's my mate. He fancies men. Here's my other mate. He fancies women. I don't understand homophobia. I really don't. In fact, the only plausible account I've ever come up with is that because society taught us it was awful for so long, people who are actually gay have buried it so deep within themselves that their denial has transmogrified into fury and anger. I mentioned a few times that some of my most assiduous and devoted trolls have a very homoerotic flavour about their communications with me when they creep through my block mute and quality filter. So I don't get that. But speaking of trolls, if you didn't like me and I now said something homophobic, you would shout until the roof came in that I was homophobic. There is a difference. There's a substantive difference between saying something homophobic and genuinely being homophobic. It's true also of racism and sexism and misogyny and all the other isms. I could sit here now and say something, not realising the microphone is on, that would be a sackable offence, regardless of whether or not the last 10, 11, 12 years of broadcasting gave the lie to those words representing my true feelings. But you can't know. So the language that Jared O'Mara used to describe gay people was particularly vile. And therefore, I would argue that any gay man or woman in Sheffield Hallam could rightly feel that he would not be able to properly represent their interests. If he has said stuff like that in the past, he would need to persuade you either that he said it in his cups or that he has changed profoundly since when he said it. The Toby Young stuff was very different because it was published journalism. Again, I'd stress that the gross sort of goatish tweets were, for me, not the straw that broke the camel's back. And then you move on to Ben Bradley, who is the latest politician to get this retrospective ideological audit, I suppose you could call it. And I find some of what he has said a little bit difficult to stomach. When you talk about poor people having children, you have to be very, very careful not to sound like you're harking back to the days of children being sent up chimneys, of mill owners and master sweeps. And he wasn't careful, but he was writing a blog that was presumably designed to be provocative. And he's only 28. I'd bring that into it. Toby Young, 56, and tried to argue that he'd been immature when he wrote some of this stuff that he'd written in his 50s and his 40s. This lad's 28. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just feel we should resist the urge to look at what his party allegiances are and judge him based on that rather than on what he's done. I'm uncomfortable with people even suggesting that poor people should be sterilised, that poor women should be sterilised. He wrote that in 2012 in a blog supporting the so-called benefits cap. We know that the benefits cap has caused untold misery up and down the country, but we also know that there's something fundamentally obnoxious about the idea of a couple, even if it is the man bites dog school of journalism. They're so rare, these stories, that's why the newspapers go to town on them when they unearth one, and for reasons that perhaps we'll never understand. Things that are newsworthy because they are exceptional then become used to prove that they're not exceptional at all. If there really were people up and down the country with 14 children and a council castle, then it wouldn't be news. It's precisely because it's so at odds with the normal experience that they end up being plastered all over the magazines and the newspapers and sitting with Lorraine Kelly on the telly. I know that's just a statement of the obvious, but it's also a statement of the obvious that we as a public now do the precise opposite of what the rareness of these stories should lead us to do. So, yes, it is. It's galling to everybody as they drag their carcass out of bed in the morning to go to work, to think that there's somebody anywhere lying in bed until lunchtime, breakfasting upon super-strength lager and half an ounce of cannabis, and then settling down for an afternoon watching Pointless, The Chase, and that really funny one with the coin-pushing machine. I've been at home a bit lately in the afternoons, clearly. Do you see what I mean? So, am I defending him? No, I don't think I am. As I understand his comments, he was just saying that if you've had a lot of children and you're not in work and you're historically unemployed, you've been unemployed for a long time while having a lot of children, maybe you should think about having a vasectomy. That doesn't really cut to my quick or offend me profoundly. Comments about sterilisation, I think a little bit perhaps more difficult to defend. And then talking about the London riots, his latest indiscretion, his latest misdemeanour is to suggest that on the occasion of the London riots he would have been in favour of police brutality. So what I'd really like to do is have a conversation about the criteria by which historical comments should be judged, because I'm a great believer in consistency. This, it seems to me, is the first step we have to take towards getting the country back into some sort of harmony and order. We have to have consistency. So you have to be judged according to your conduct, not according to your back catalogue of loyalties and allegiances. You would like to think, for example, that the misdemeanors of a politician. The expenses scandal was a great example of this, I think. I think perhaps slightly rose-tinted spectacles, but I think we were fairly equable in our criticism of politicians during the expenses scandal because there was so much misbehaviour on so many different sides. You could, off the top of your head, cite the Conservative who charged us for getting his moat cleaned or installing a duck house on his pond, and you could remember the Labour MP in Luton South who was claiming for just about everything, while her compadre on the same street, the Labour MP for Luton North, had the lowest claims of all. Kelvin Hopkins, I think, was the Luton North, and if memory serves, Margaret Moran was Luton South. So during the expenses scandal, for a very sort of little brief window in British political history, we seem to be running the slide rule over politicians according to their conduct, not according to their party. What are we going to do with Ben Bradley, MP for Mansfield, Tory Vice Chairman for Youth? He's come out in support of police brutality and used the words sterilisation and vasectomies in the context of unemployed people, unemployed parents. What do you think? Just give me a buzz. I'm going to go in on this one and say, if you're in your early 20s when you do stuff, you should be forgiven. As long as it applies to everybody. That's what I mean by consistency. Do you agree or disagree? Even something as potentially vile as calling for the sterilisation of unemployed women. 03456060973. If you're not allowed to be an idiot in your early 20s, yeah, I mean this, although you can tell it's a work in progress. If you're not allowed to be an idiot in your early 20s, then I'm not quite sure who's going to end up going into public life. I'm already worried about the thickness of skin that you need to do it. Looking at some of the comments from MPs recently about the mail that they receive and regularly, of course, being exposed personally to fairly vile abuse, I worry that you'd have to have skin as thick as mine to come into a job like this. You want to stand up on the radio and speak truth to power, you've got to be prepared to get a kicking on social media, which is fine because you can close it down, but eventually you're going to get a kicking in the Daily Mail and the Sun as well. Your mum's going to see it, her friends are going to see it. And if you're lucky enough to have a mum who can laugh it off, then great. But if you're not, I just think this kind of atmosphere of unfair and inconsistent judgment of public figures is creating an environment in which the only people we're going to attract are either rhinoceros-thick skins or sociopaths who don't care about anybody's opinions about anything. And they're already running the newspapers. The last thing we want is them running the government. So I don't know if I'm going to get away with this, am I? The position I'm taking on Ben Bradley, the Conservative Party Vice Chairman, who has expressed support for both police brutality and a kind of sterilisation of the poor. There's some fairly grim language here. Let's be absolutely clear. For once, I think police brutality should be encouraged, and it should be directed, according to this blog post in 2011, at people hanging around town centres with their faces covered. And then he described, or he stated in 2012, that before long we would be drowning in a vast sea of unemployed wasters, which is pretty much the opinion that the editors of The Sun and the Daily Mail put their efforts daily into persuading you to hold. I can't really blame him for falling into this trap. He got caught, the blog got explored, and he apologised and claimed maturity. I'm slightly troubled by the fact that he apologised for his inappropriate language. I would like him to apologise for the thoughts and opinions that he held, really. Because if you're going to forgive him because he was 22, 23 years old at the time, which I think we probably should, you would like evidence that he changed his tune. I don't know. Why am I talking? It's your turn. Phone lines are open. You'll get through if you hit the numbers now. It's a broad chat about, well, yeah, simply put, for me, if you're going to be barred from public life because of something you did in your early 20s, then we've got a problem. But, of course, most of us drift towards the right as we get older, not towards the left. The idea that you become more tolerant, compassionate and inclusive, while it certainly happens, it flies in the face of the sort of received wisdom, doesn't it? So what do you think? 22 after 11. Jamie's in Chester. Jamie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. This sort of discussion resonated with me a little bit because what you said about people's criticism of people in these sorts of situations often being driven by ideology, political ideology, rather than actual assessment of the situation.
Yeah.
Is something that I came across on social media, because I don't consider myself aligned with any particular party, or right, left, or centre. I just call things as I see them. But because of the
Join
views
the club,
I've taken
Jamie.
over the, well, yeah, because of the views I've taken over the last couple of years, a lot of my followers on Twitter are left wing or central.
Yes.
And I've got some are right wing, but not many. And actually, I saw this about Ben Bradley, and I thought the way that it was handled and the criticism of him generally was not. I didn't agree with it, because whilst I don't agree with what he said, because of his age and what he said, I don't think it makes him now unsuitable to be an MP. But I felt like I couldn't express that, because I knew that a lot of the people that I followed would instantly rail against me, because their criticism was based on ideology. And actually, that was a sort of a light bulb moment for me, because I realised that even the people that I'd been on the same side of discussions as recently, I didn't find myself on the same side of those discussions with them because we held the same views. It was because we just happened to align, but actually they were based on ideology and I wasn't.
Yes, you're based on events and evidence.
Yeah.
Here's the problem, though. There are, because what you're saying is you have to engage with people that you disagree with, and we all run the risk, unless you're lucky enough to have a phone-in show, we all run the risk of ending up in an echo chamber. But there are some things I don't think we should ever have engaged with. I don't know if you've seen Hugo Rifkin's piece today about Holocaust denial. I mean, it's terrifying. He's had an exchange with an out-and-out Nazi. Mate, it's one of the most frightening things I've ever read. And oddly, Hugo and I were exchanging tweets earlier this week when I was reminded of about a year ago, I was interviewed by The Observer or The New Statesman, I can't remember which, and I said if Holocaust denial moves into the mainstream, which is what would follow on naturally from the kind of validation of white supremacism and racism that we've seen with Brexit and Trump, if Holocaust denial moves into the mainstream next, then we're all, and I used a word I can't repeat on the radio, and what Hugo has experienced in the last few days suggests that it is moving in that direction. So I don't know what ideologies would you never engage with? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, well, actually, interestingly enough, before I read that thread from Hugo Rifkin yesterday, I would have said Nazism, actually.
Yeah.
But actually, the fact that he engaged with it was enlightening in a weird sort of way. I thought it was for this reason. I thought it was because I think when people think of Nazis, they tend to think of people that are so flagrantly objectionable and unreasonable, and that's putting it lightly.
Yeah.
But it just so happened they were allowed in through some sort of error of history. The things came together and they were allowed in.
Yeah.
When you saw the guy that Hugo was exchanging with, he was speaking so calmly and reasonably about something that was so horrific.
Yes, you're right. You're right. I mean, my light bulb went on a little earlier than that. When, to be honest, when Donald Trump got elected, I suddenly understood how Holocausts can happen almost overnight.
Yeah, well, the comment that did it for me with Hugo's thread was the guy explained his ideology, and Hugo, I'm paraphrasing, said something along the lines of, what
would happen to my family? And he answered pretty much by saying, I don't really care.
Well, the one that did it for me is Hugo said something on the lines of, so why are you not a Nazi, after it had been explained? And the guy said, I'm separated by being in a different time and place, which basically means I am a Nazi.
Just with a different name,
I'm just not a Nazi in the 1930s, which is incredible. But the way that he could explain that so calmly just shows you that...
But if he'd done that in his early 20s and became vice chairman of the Conservative Party 5 years later, we probably wouldn't be saying that it's excusable behaviour, and I'm sure he's matured. Or would we? I don't know. Briefly, because I want to get some other voices on.
Yeah.
What would you?
Well, I think, and one of the things I was saying to your producer is I do think it depends on the view that's expressed, because maturity only excuses a certain range of things.
And that means as long as it's consistent, it can be variable. But, you know, I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable if it turned out that Ben Bradley had been writing articles in praise of genocide or in praise of or denial of the Holocaust. He hasn't, for the record, but it does just add an extra level of inquiry to my question about what should be forgiven and what shouldn't. Age plays a big part for me. I'd love to know whether or not you think it should. Jamie, great stuff. And if you don't follow me on Twitter and you want, because increasingly it seems to be an adjunct to the programme, then at Mr. James OB is the name that I use on there, and if a few tweets into my feed, you'll see a link to the Hugo Rifkin article, and indeed to the astonishing exchange. It's not often something truly stops you in your tracks, but you need to read it. It's chilling, genuinely chilling. 28 after 11. Ben is in Sutton. Ben, what would you like to say?
First of all, happy birthday for Saturday, James.
Thank you, mate. Appreciate it.
No problem. If everything that was held against me, I mean, I'm only 28.
Same age as him, I think. Exactly the same age as Ben Bradley.
Well, this is why I rang.
Yeah.
Because my early 20s, if I was pulled on some of the things that I said in my early 20s, I'd probably never work again. I'd never have a girlfriend again. I used to be a member of the English Defence League, and I couldn't be any further away from that now. I was homophobic. I was racist. I was...
Seriously?
Yeah, mate, honestly. It couldn't be any different to what I am now. So
What changed? What changed, Ben?
Right, try not to inflate your ego too much. But you had a major part in that. You happened to come along at the same... I started listening to you at the right point.
Yeah.
I met a woman about 3-4 years ago, and she quite frankly found it boring. I didn't have anything interesting to say to her. And I happened to be working with a guy that listened to you, and he recommended you. And at the very same time, it was like a combination of experiences. I started working with a lot of foreigners, a lot of Polish guys and whatever else, and my viewpoint almost overnight just sort of flipped and changed. And I now speak to absolutely none of those people that I used to associate with. I don't hold a single one of those views anymore. I now help the homeless. If I met my past self when I was 20 years old, honestly, you'd have to fight to keep me off him. Because I just want to shake him and say...
mate, you've got to stop now, because you're right. The old ego is... well, ego's not quite the right word. On the days when I wonder why I bother, Ben, I imagine people like you listening to the programme, and so to actually speak to you it's quite a privilege and a pleasure. So thank you so much for that.
No, thank you, James.
No, thank you, Ben.
It's the simple questions. The simple questions is...
Stop it now, seriously.
Why do you feel like that? Why do you hate gays? Why do you hate black people? You know, why?
Yes.
Why?
Not the what, the why.
Exactly. And I think... Never bothered to ask. Never bothered. I had this ridiculous notion in my mind that being gay is against God. I've never been to church in my entire life. I couldn't care less about God. But it was an argument that was so widely used and widely accepted by the people that I associated with.
That you'd never stop to think. I'm not sure I've ever thought of it in such sort of simple terms. Just never. Why would you? You're too busy getting on with it. And if you're surrounded by these sort of influences, you go along with them. But if the deputy, I mean, what's interesting? Actually, I'm going to come to you after the news. No, but you're not allowed to talk about me anymore. All right? Otherwise, people will think I'm only keeping you on to so I can enjoy the sensations. Ben, stay there. 11:31. How much weight should we place on youthful indiscretions committed by people who subsequently end up in public life? Ben's on the line. He's undergone something of a transformation, politically and socially, from a sort of self-described EDL member, racist and homophobic, to the polar opposite of all those things, which I think leads us beautifully into the question that only you can answer. How could we tell it was true in the case of Ben Bradley? Because all he's actually done is apologise for inappropriate language. He hasn't disavowed the views expressed in the way that you have. So what test? Can you think of a way, Ben, in which we could actually establish whether or not someone claiming to have turned their back on toxic views held in the past genuinely has?
It's a difficult one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well... I mean, to be fair, James, you've only got my claims that I've turned my back on.
You're absolutely right, although I'm going to take it to the bank, unless you muff it all up by shouting some sort of Enoch Powell slogan just before hanging up.
No, definitely not. There was... I can't speak on his behalf, but on mine, it was a couple of things. It was a sense of loneliness and having somewhere to belong. There was a sense of meaning. I felt as if I was doing something important, standing for something, which was very simple to flip the coin and stand for the other side, really. It's much more justifiable. Yeah. But if I'm just completely honest, it's immaturity. It's just, I was young and stupid.
And you can say that. So presumably then you have some sympathy for Ben Bradley, but neither of us have any complete confidence that he's changed his views at all since expressing himself in such unfortunate language.
I have very little confidence in it, in fact,
really?
if I'm honest.
Go on.
simply because whenever I speak to anybody, and believe it or not, I still come up against people that share the same views that I used to.
Of course.
And I try to enlighten them in the way that I've been enlightened and say, look, why?
Yeah.
Why do you feel this? I want to take a book from your page, if you like, a page from your book even. Try to... And I'm always very, very adamant about how sorry I am about the way that I've affected people, because I'm sure my actions have affected people directly.
Yes.
And I heard someone on your show not that long ago speaking about their balance sheet, trying to do...
that's right, yeah.
Trying to outweigh the bad with the good.
It was helping people with council problems, wasn't it, when we were talking about funerals?
Yeah,
that's
fantastic guy as well, brilliant. And that stuck with me, and I suppose that's kind of what I've been doing, is trying to even the balance sheet. And I like to think that people can tell from me the way I speak about things and fully acknowledging what I did, that I actually genuinely believed in what I was doing. And that's really important.
Yes.
Acknowledging that I believed in it, not just, it was just something stupid I said. Because we all say stupid things, but...
Yes.
I think
that's what you need to establish, what is meant and what is really in there ideologically, as opposed to what are mere words. The problem is, though, who are you going to put in charge of making these judgments?
Well, it's the public, isn't it? At the end of the day, it's again, it's a difficult one, and I'm not qualified to make that judgment.
No,
I personally don't believe that he is sorry for what he said, and I think he's hoping it will just blow over and go away. But if he really meant it, I think he would have stood up and he would have said, I meant that at the time, and God, I was stupid, and this is how I've behaved differently since.
In many ways. No, you've just provided us with a masterclass in what a genuine disavowal sounds like, although by your own admission that we're all relying on our own instincts while listening to you. There's no evidence to back it up, but and also, in my case, I'm completely biased because you were so nice about me, but for everybody else listening, that there is a lesson there. Ben, mate, that was special. I'm so grateful to you, but I'm not going to go on about it because that would be immodest. But I really am really, really grateful to you for telling me that. Peter is in Dudley. Peter, what do you think?
Hi, James. So I was listening to what your previous caller was just saying, and it's an interesting one because I'm the same age as the guy in question.
Ben Bradley, you're all 28,
Ben
actually.
Bradley's Yeah. Oh, right. So the other bloke was 28 as well.
Everyone's 28 except me. I'm 46. Carry on.
And I was a politics student, and it's funny, at that time he would have been obviously the same age as me and probably going through the same education process as I was. Yes. And I was probably more left-wing than I am now, but I put that down to the fact that I'm married, I've got a job and a family to support. So whereas I was perhaps a little bit more altruistic, I'm perhaps a little bit more realistic today. So where the comments about, sterilising people that are having 14 kids, I'd have probably been in an uproar about. But whereas today, like you mentioned previously, when you are working hard and, we'd love to have another kid, but we've got to be pragmatic about what we can afford, that would chime with someone, that would chime on, that would get someone worked up about hearing that kind of thing. But interestingly enough, and what I'd say about the Ben Bradley case is that he is a young Conservative and untypical of what most Conservative candidates have gone through. At 28, he's an MP, which is pretty unique in this day and age. And I think in order to get notice, you've got to be polemical at that kind of in that kind of way. Just looking at his background, he's sort of grammar school, I'd say, I guess lower sort of middle class kind of background. And a polemical level of kind of politics and that gets you noticed. Mm-hmm. The next stage from that is getting to where he is now. So like your previous caller said, is he truly sorry? But equally, there'd have been people in the party that would have spotted him and either groomed him for success. Well,
that's very true. Well, I don't know, because this was the thing. Joe Johnson, bless his little cotton socks, refusing to answer any questions at all about what he did in terms of due diligence with regards to Toby Young's track record. I find it perfectly plausible that they didn't do any. They had no idea about how unpleasant some of his comments and articles and tweets would be. So I don't know that anyone necessarily championed Ben Bradley while being fully cognizant of what he'd written on his blogs back in 2011 and 12.
Well, okay, yeah, that's a fair point. I guess we won't. I guess we won't know.
We can't know, can we? Really?
Yeah, no. So maybe that's a moot point. But what there's.
Would you give him the benefit of the doubt on this one?
As in a way, yes, I would, and but I'd also treat it with a heavy or healthy dose of caution as well, because I do believe there's no smoke without fire. But I'd give him the benefit of the doubt based on the fact that him being of my generation, where social media now and your online personal profile it comes under much more scrutiny than it would have done if you'd have been born 10 years previously or 10 years hence from when he was. You'd perhaps a level of ignorance, perhaps it was like a blog corner where he was just getting out what he thought, and it was maybe there was, I don't know, sort of 10 people that were paying any attention to what he was sort of writing. And it's quite different now that he's actually in a position of public office and he's got to be accountable to what he's saying.
Yeah, that's all good. I think that all makes sense, actually. Ben was relying on his instincts and saying it just doesn't quite ring true for me. Emma's been in touch pointing out he hasn't really apologised for anything except inappropriate language, whereas in fact what we're objecting to is speaking about police brutality or sterilisation of poor women in such a sort of callous and unfeeling way. That is about his intention and his beliefs rather than the words that he chose to employ to express them, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And like you said, I mean, if he said, like we've already said it. If he was truly sorry for what he said, he'd apologise and come out with a statement saying, or maybe he wouldn't, I don't know, but he'd come out with a statement saying, what I said there was naive, it was stupid, but it's the language he's apologising for. So, like they said, the sentiment's there.
If there is a case of another Ian Tomlinson or something like that, then how can he be? When you're thinking about representation of the people by the politician. If there is a case of police brutality and he is in any way involved, either it's a constituent who is claiming it, or it is in years to come part of his purview professionally, part of his brief. I guess having this on your track record, welcoming it, encouraging it, to use his own word, it does leave a very long aftertaste. But Ben, I think, becomes the patron saint of this hour in a way, because he clearly would be utterly unemployable. He'd be hounded out of public office in a heartbeat if the attitudes of his early 20s were dredged up 6 or 7 years later. And yet I think most of us listening fully accepted his explanation that he'd changed completely. I don't think we should necessarily judge anybody's suitability for public life in their 30s by the actions or comments of their early 20s. But how can you be sure that an apology is sincere? I like this word, disavow. It was, of course, used a lot last year, wasn't it, in the context of Donald Trump and white supremacists, when a lot of people felt he should disavow the Nazi supporters who, by an astonishing coincidence, also supported him. That was when he ended up saying there were good people on both sides, which is certainly a novel approach to white supremacism and Nazism, but we are where we are. How do you know if it's true? Because I mean this. I don't think that this Conservative Party youth vice chairman should necessarily be hounded out of his job. I was perfectly comfortable with seeing Toby Young hounded out of his, and I was perfectly comfortable with seeing Jared O'Mara hounded out of his as well, on the issue of representation. But Jared O'Mara probably fits into this age catalogue as well. So maybe he deserved a bit more of an even break, in the way that I think Ben Bradley does as well. And, of course, one's Labour and one's Conservative, so stick that in your pipe and smoke it. Steve's in Pontypool. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James. Just want to echo some of the comments of your first caller from Sutton. Having only discovered your show about 3 months ago, you're the first radio DJ that's actually changed or presenter that's changed my opinion on the subject. So I don't think you're going to be able to get out your ego out of the studio this morning. All the blood that's kind of been poured over you. It's been a fantastic show.
Thank you.
Your comments regarding Ben, his maybe undiplomatic comments in his 20s shouldn't necessarily be held against him going into public life. Well, if you've between any age of 16 and 25 get yourself a criminal record, that's going to stop you ever serving in the police force, the fire brigade, the ambulance service, the call centres, and a huge number of jobs, whether that offence was for physical violence, fighting a pub, theft, all sorts of different things. And that's on your record for the rest of your life, and that is going to bar you from a number of opportunities.
I don't know that that's 100% correct. I think there are they expire, don't they? And there are increasing calls for more employers to either turn a blind eye or to actively help in the process of rehabilitation. But there's certainly a kernel of truth in what you say. I don't think it is quite as blanket as you state.
Well, you have something as a position which is your criminal record is spent.
Yes.
But if you want to be employed by the police, your criminal record isn't spent. They have an exemption. If you want to be employed in education, if you want to be employed by the ambulance.
But even if you were just done for shoplifting or something like that.
Exactly. Oh yes.
Okay.
Most definitely. Even if it's just done for shoplifting. Well, for example, I know of a story about 5 years ago where a fire chief didn't declare his criminal record for an assault when he was 18, had done 28 years in the fire service and was summarily dismissed when it came up on his when he went to apply to coach kids that he had a criminal record.
Good grief.
The situation has changed greatly. Now, I totally agree with what you're saying, that we all do some daft things in our youth, and at some point our youth becomes our early adulthood and we have to become responsible for our actions. But if we're going to pardon politicians for being slightly undiplomatic in their early 20s, then are we going to pardon that across the board? I think it's something that's, we have one rule for one and one rule for the other isn't necessarily the same. My opinion is that there's people out there with a criminal record that stops them getting a job. Well, there's politicians out there with some pretty poor Twitter comments and maybe should be barring them from getting a job.
So you want to see even more consistency, because you're not arguing that two wrongs would make a right. You're arguing that you can come out with, you could theoretically post something utterly vile that's not criminal, and it wouldn't affect your employment opportunities at all. But if you got caught shoplifting when you were 16 years old, then it closes down various career paths to you. Is there a personal connection here, Steve? Are you, or is it just an overview?
There is a personal connection, yeah. A family member is struggling greatly with this years after a stupid thing when they were he was 22.
Yes. And it is unfair, because, I mean, who honestly would meet their 14-year-old self, or their 15-year-old self, or indeed, when you get to my age, your 25-year-old self, and recognise
Well, James, it's our age, because we are the same age, and and it is that, and if a family member has come across this time and time again, and it is galling.
You have to let people grow, but you also need to have a better test, perhaps, than we've managed to conjure up together for determining whether or not they really have grown, or whether or not they're just telling you they've grown. It's a bit like being a parent, isn't it? It's a bit. Have you brushed your teeth? We need to find a way to find out whether they've just rubbed a bit of toothpaste around their mouth or have actually scrubbed their teeth clean. Because at the moment, just sniffing their gob doesn't work.
No, it certainly doesn't. Certainly once they get towards the teenager stage.
I'll take your word for it. Steve, thank you, mate. And thank you so much for the kind words. It's Mystery Hour next, don't worry. We shall have to put a lid upon all these outbreaks of kindness and compliment. But a couple more calls in the interim. And also thanks to Ben for reminding me with his little happy birthday that I got a late present yesterday off Melody. So thank you so much for that, Melody. You're absolutely right. It is indeed a book that I want to read, and it is indeed a book that I don't currently, or didn't previously have, so thank you. 11:55 is the time. Who's next? Al's in High Wycombe. Al, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. How are you doing?
Very well, Al. What's on your mind?
Right, I can't believe nobody's brought up the fact that Donald Trump, who is President of the United States, pretty much makes a living off putting horrendous tweets out for everyone to read, and he's, one of the most powerful people in the world. So I don't think it's really fair for us to judge Ben on something he wrote a few years ago.
Well, hang on a minute. It is perfectly fair to judge him on things he wrote a few years ago if you find Donald Trump's continuing presence in public life to be an insult to everything that we used to consider valuable in society.
I absolutely do. I just, I'm surprised nobody's brought it up, that's all.
Well, they have. Is that all you rang in for? Because No, good. Go on. And also, just for the record, Jared O'Mara is 36, so it is a little bit nuanced, perhaps, than 28. Go on.
I'm listening to one of your first callers, Ben, who was brilliant, I thought, said about his redemption, which I know is getting a little bit off topic, but I'm very much in the same boat. When I was in my 20s, I was in the army. I think being part and parcel of being in the army, you'll move towards the right wing anyway because of the jobs you do. So yeah, I was very much in that category where if I met my younger self, I'd think he's a bit of an idiot, to be honest.
Yes.
And it was only later on when I was working abroad doing private security. I was doing anti-piracy off the coast of Somalia. So again, you're in that environment again.
Yes.
I actually read a book by Yuval Harari called *Sapiens*. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
That was a present for my birthday off Emma that I haven't started reading yet. This is getting ridiculous. It's like one big happy family. No wonder the Sun hates us.
Honestly, it's incredible. It changed my life completely, and now I'm a different person from reading it. It's an anthropological book about how every one of us have come from the same place. Oh my God, I lend it to people now who I used to be friends with to try and give a positive change in their life to make things better. I know I'm plugging a book for someone.
No, you don't. It's a book that a lot of people have recommended to me, and it doesn't, however, change this central problem that we've got, is how do you know if someone's telling the truth? If you were to claim that they've completely changed since their youth, because I've got no reason to doubt you or Ben or all the other people who very somewhat humblingly get in touch to say they've been on similar journeys since they started listening to this programme. But you know, if you had just got a big job and then I found these comments and then I said, what's going on? And then you said, oh, no, I've really changed since then. But prior to that exchange, I'd seen nothing to suggest that you had. Then how do we know? How do we know whether he's telling the truth or not? He's apologising for inappropriate language. Maybe he still believes that the police should beat people up and that poor people should be sterilised.
Well, I thoroughly hope someone, as much as I'm a bit optimistic, I'd like to think someone in a high position of power doesn't have those thoughts. But other than at interview, you know, releasing all of your public information from Facebook, from Twitter, there's no real way anyone could know that. And I don't think that's a fair way to bar someone from a job. You know, we should be judging him on his ability to do the job rather than things.
So you'd give him. I suppose we're discussing the benefit of the doubt and how big a role does his age play in that on your case? In your case,
I can only say from the same experience. I'm a year younger than him. We've got a lot of young people calling in, which is good. But I can't say it'd be fair to deny me a job from things I did 7 years ago.
No, I'm on your side on this one, and I would be if it was a Labour MP as well, which is, I guess, the very definition of the sort of fair-minded and equable approach to issues that we try to adopt on this programme, and which it would seem from the course of the last hour doesn't actually constitute dancing in the dark. It is making a difference.